Hi, this is Dr. Gwen Fisher in Psychology 440, Industrial Psychology, Module 4. This is a module about the criterion problem, and this is specifically Module 4.2, entitled The Ultimate or Conceptual Criterion. The learning objective for Module 4.2 is that by the end of this module, you should be able to explain the difference between what we call the conceptual or ultimate criterion and what we mean by the actual criterion. I'll explain this as we go forward. So the conceptual criterion is a theoretical construct, and it includes all aspects of what we're talking about. It might be easiest to think about criteria in terms of job performance. So conceptually, it's all possible ways that we might be able to assess job performance. The actual criterion is what we actually measure. In other words, how do we actually capture what we mean by job performance? For example, let's think for a moment about teaching effectiveness. There might be many different ways that we might think of teaching effectiveness, and the conceptual criterion might include all of these different things. How students perceive the teacher, how students learn, perhaps how peers would evaluate someone's teaching. There are many different ways to think about what constitutes teaching effectiveness. However, it's typically only measured via things like student ratings. One of the challenges with conceptual versus actual criteria is that we can end up with either criterion deficiency or criterion contamination. I'll explain these as we go forward. Using this Venn diagram where the conceptual criterion is depicted on the left and the actual criterion is shown on the right, what we want to do is establish as much overlap as possible between the conceptual criterion and the actual criterion. So again, back to the example of teaching effectiveness, we want conceptually everything that might be constituted in that, including not only students' reactions, but learning, perhaps results or other aspects of the criteria, with what we actually measure. Criterion deficiency occurs when the actual criterion does not overlap with the conceptual criterion. In other words, we fail to measure part of the conceptual. Criterion contamination is where the actual criterion includes other things, extraneous things leading to error. So for example, there's been some recent research that has shown that ratings of teaching effectiveness can be biased, and in fact it can measure things like the teacher's gender. Believe it or not, and women out there, this might bother you, but we've seen research that systematically male teachers receive higher ratings than female teachers when all other factors are held constant. So criterion contamination in that case includes the gender of the teacher, which in theory, hopefully we agree, is not necessarily relevant to performance. Criterion relevance is the degree to which the actual criterion and the conceptual criterion overlap. Criterion relevance is what we're really trying to achieve, and we want to maximize as much of this overlap as possible. So now I'd like you to think of an example with regard to student performance. This is one of the activities listed for your course. Think about the criterion of student performance. What does the conceptual criterion look like? In other words, ideally, the essence of being a student, what are all possible things that might make up the domain of how students perform in a course? I'd like you to make a list of the different aspects that make up student performance. Once you make up this list, I'd like you to think of how is it typically measured? And does actual performance come close to overlapping completely with everything you listed for the conceptual criterion? If there isn't perfect overlap, why do you think that's the case? You can work on this on your own. In the next module, we'll be talking about criteria for criteria. And following this, there will be a question for you just as a simple check on your learning. Thank you.